Welcome back to the 9th edition of the Rugby History Project. Chasing the Egg, a short history of the rugby ball. The rugby ball is one of the most recognisable aspects of rugby, but also one of the most bizarre. How exactly did we end up as egg chasers? If you ask most people to describe a ball, they would describe a round sphere. However, in the sport of rugby, we use a bizarre ellipsoidal ball. Lovingly referred to as an egg or egg-shaped by many rugby union fans, the ball has become an icon of the sport. But how exactly did we end up with such a shape in the first place? Whilst it is incredibly unlikely that a young man at rugby school named William Webb Ellis had anything to do with the invention of rugby football, his time at the school does coincide with the probable first rugby ball. The first rugby balls were made by local shoemakers in Rugby Town, with the firm run by one William Gilbert being recorded as making balls in the 1820s. While some have claimed that Gilbert made the first rugby ball in 1823, the exact date isn't quite so clear. Gilberts themselves claim that the ball picked up by William Webb Ellis in 1823 was made by their firm. However, this would suggest that the company had been making balls for a period of time before this. Regardless of the exact date, at some point after making their initial ball, Gilbert's self-titled firm would switch from a shoemaker's to a specialist sports equipment manufacturer. William Gilbert's original rugby football was not unlike a standard games ball of the period, an inflated pig's bladder covered in a panelled leather outer layer. The first rugby balls were not specifically egg-shaped, or to give it its geometric term, ellipsoidal. The balls were generally rounder, described as plum-shaped by the World Rugby Museum, and more similar to a modern association football than a modern rugby ball. Due to the usage of pig's bladders as the ball's inner sphere, the balls were extremely irregular, as the size and shape of the ball were dictated by the shape of the bladder itself and how it inflated. Inflation with the ball was done manually by somewhat willing participants using a clay pipe. This would have been an unpleasant task, as inflation was done with a raw, untreated bladder. Whilst getting up close and personal with raw offal would have been an unpleasant task regardless of circumstance, it also carried a large risk of disease. Richard Linden was another shoemaker based in Rugby who made rugby balls. His firm provided balls not only for rugby school but also for the University of Oxford, the University of Cambridge and Dublin University Football Club. Having trained under Gilbert as his apprentice, Linden would go on to revolutionise the rugby ball. Having lost his wife in 1843 to a lung disease potentially caused by inflating pig's bladders, Linden sought to develop an alternative inner for the balls. Development took place over a number of years, with vulcanised Indian rubber eventually selected as the replacement. Due to the stiffness of the material, Linden also developed an accompanying brass hand pump which was used to inflate the ball. Despite winning awards for his inventions upon showcasing them in London in 1861, Linden did not trademark them, and soon enough, other manufacturers began producing balls using the same techniques, one of which would be Linden's former employer and rival, William Gilbert. The first definite notion of a non-spherical ball used in rugby rules comes from 1857, with the description of the ball pointing in Thomas Hughes's Tom Brown's School Days. Whilst the book itself takes place in 1835, it is not until its publication in 1857 that we have a record of a pointed ball. And now that the two sides have fairly sundered and each occupies its own ground and we get a good look at them, what absurdity is this? You don't mean to say that 50 or 60 of boys in white trousers, many of them quite small, are going to play that huge mass opposite? Indeed I do, gentlemen. They're going to try at any rate, and won't make such a bad fight of it either, mark my word. For hasn't old Brooke won the toss with his lucky halfpenny, and you've got a choice of goals and kick-off? The new ball you may see lie there quite by itself, in the middle, pointing towards the school or island goal. In another minute it will be well on its way there. Thomas Hughes in Tom Brown's School Days, 1857. The slight change in ball shape and the indication that it was pointed suggests that the ball had evolved to better suit the game. Whilst rugby football rules initially was a kicking-based game, the change to a slightly pointed ball suggests that hand passing of the ball had become more common. When the Rugby Football Union was formed in 1871, the official law book did not contain any regulations about the size or shape of the ball. However, publication of the laws, along with standardisation of association football rules, led to a popularisation of the game and an increased demand for rugby balls. William Gilbert continued to make rugby balls at his shop in Rugby Town Centre until his death in 1877, upon which time his nephew took over the family business. It would be an update to the law book in 1892 that the size and the dimensions of the rugby ball were set by the RFU. They stated that the ball must be 11 to 11¼ inches in length, with an end-on circumference of 30 to 31 inches and an end-width circumference of 25½ to 26 inches. The ball was to be 12 to 13 ounces in weight and hand-sewn with no less than 8 stitches to the inch. The new laws did not specify the construction materials nor explicitly state a shape beyond the measurements. This allowed the development of the ball shape as the game itself developed. Accordingly, the RFU and World Rugby adjusted the specifications of the ball in various updated editions of the law book. The early 20th century saw the widest variations in style of the rugby ball. While some preferred a rounder 6-panel ball, South Africans preferred an 8-sided ball, which was reported to have better grip, and those in Australia and New Zealand preferred a pointed torpedo-style ball. The English, however, preferred a 4-panel ball, such as those made by Gilbert, and eventually, in 1961, a 4-panel ball would be specified within the law book. The largest change in the history of the rugby ball since Lyndon's invention came in the 1970s, when traditional leather was replaced by synthetic materials. Leather balls were heavy and frequently became waterlogged, making them even heavier. To combat this, Mitre introduced the multiplex ball in 1970. The synthetic ball was as much of an instant hit as you can get in a sport like rugby union. It wouldn't be until the launch of Gilbert's Barbarian ball in the early 1980s that the tide would change. England men used the iconic white ball for the first time in the 1981 Six Nations. The Barbarian ball featured a higher percentage of natural rubber in the outer material than the smooth Mitre ball, giving the players more grip and therefore more control. Overarching change, however, took the best part of a decade, with countries such as Wales and France still using traditional leather balls well into the 1980s, with the final usage of a leather ball in a men's international test match taking place in 1986. The Mitre synthetic ball would become the first ever Men's Rugby World Cup ball a year later. Adidas would provide the ball for the Men's Rugby World Cup in 1991, whilst Gilbert Barbarian balls would be used in the first Women's Rugby World Cup in that same year. Whilst the rugby ball has evolved over time to benefit the needs of the players, women have used the same ball as their male counterparts since the advent of the modern women's rugby movement in the 1960s. One of the beautiful things about the game is the fact that, unlike basketball, tennis or ice hockey, the laws, pitch and equipment are the same regardless of the gender of the players on the pitch. However, World Rugby are attempting to change this. Following a controversial trial at international age grade competitions, it was announced in late 2025 that the HSB Women's Sevens competition would use a size 4.5 ball for the upcoming season. The new size sits between the two current standard sizes of a child size 4 and an adult size 5. However, the overwhelming majority of the women's rugby community is against this move. Wendy Young from YSC Rugby launched a worldwide ball size survey following the announcement and found that 94.9% of those surveyed were against the change. Young has pointed out that World Rugby has only released selective data from self-funded studies. Said studies apparently show positive feedback from players and improvements in line-out throwing. However, those who have watched women's age grade competitions in recent years will tell you that the size 4.5 has a more erratic bounce and does not carry well in the air when kicked or passed. Many within the women's rugby community have been outspoken about the issues that will come with such a change, but none so much as Alice Soper, whose article The World in Their Hands explains the issues far better and with more humour than I could. Soper highlights that the inequality that women already face within rugby and how a specialised ball could create an even wider divide. If a size 4.5 ball becomes standard, grassroots clubs would no longer be able to provide women's teams with hand-me-down balls. Instead, they would need to purchase separate balls for their women's sections. Similarly, it could cause issues for nations such as Samoa, who already struggle financially. Upon investigation, size 4.5 balls are available to purchase on the Gilbert website, but on average they cost £1 more per ball and are only available in 2 elite styles. Whilst the price may not be prohibitive for many professional or elite clubs, it will be for grassroots clubs around the world, and for smaller rugby nations at the elite level. It also must be said that World Rugby's introduction of a designated women's ball comes without any real call for one. Whilst odd individual female players may have spoken about smaller balls in the past, the overwhelming majority have never even thought of such. In fact, World Rugby's concept is based on the idea that female rugby players in their entirety are smaller than their male counterparts and would therefore benefit from a smaller ball. Whilst it is correct that female second rows are not as large as their male counterparts, they are certainly taller than most male scrum halves. By using World Rugby's own argument, surely the likes of Antoine Dupont and Craig Casey are at a disadvantage for having to use a size 5 ball. There are many problems within women's rugby to which World Rugby could devote its time and money to instead of developing and trialling a cost-prohibitive ball with negligible benefits. For example, women-specific injury prevention and rehab, equalising the standard of pitches, facilities, coaches and referees, fully professionalising the women's game, including domestic leagues, and working towards eradicating the rampant sexism within rugby. Instead, we've been given a smaller ball we haven't asked for. I hope you're all well and are enjoying your new year. I wanted to begin this year with a short piece on something a little bit fun. I didn't set out to write a piece on size 4.5 balls, but it just kind of felt appropriate, as the change could be one of the biggest in rugby history, certainly in women's rugby history. I'd really recommend checking out both Wendy and Alice's work on this, along with any other work, if you haven't already done so. In unrelated news, I was recently on BBC Radio Wales talking about my favourite lads, the Scarlets, and the WRU schemings and Boxing Day rugby as a whole. If you'd like to listen to a now slightly outdated bit of content, you can find the piece on from about 1 hour 14 minutes in. If you listen to my segment on the radio and enjoy me yapping about the Scarlets and Welsh rugby in general, you can find me on the Wrap podcast every Tuesday. And if you want the links to those, you can check those out on the website. On my website, that is, obviously. If you would like more regular updates, please check out my Instagram, Twitter, Blue Sky. And as I said, all the links, references, photos, everything like that is all on the rugbyhistoryproject.com.